There's a moment in Ikiru that's just crazy to me. It's crazy how good it is. The setup is this. Our protagonist, Watanabe, has been recently diagnosed with stomach cancer, with less than a year to live, and over the course of wrestling with his mortality, develops an attachment to a former employee, a young woman named Toyo. Watanabe takes Toyo out to lunch. He buys her a new pair of stockings. In turn, Toyo lends Watanabe a vicarious sense of youth and vitality. After a while, however, Toyo begins to grow tired of hanging around this weepy old man. Part of it is that Toyo is busy. She's got a new job at a toy factory to think of. Then there's the implication of a younger woman spending so much time around a much older man. More than that though, Watanabe just kind of gives Toyo the creeps. There's a sense of Toyo's youth and vitality withering away under the dark cloud of Watanabe's age and misery. Their final meeting together takes place at a restaurant where across the way some young people are having a birthday party, and where a pair of young lovers canoodle nearby without a care in the world. It all serves to remind Toyo of everything she's missing out on when eventually Watanabe comes clean about his illness, about his looming mortality. Toyo shrinks away from him as if he's a vampire, as if he might drain the life from her. Watanabe asks Toyo what her secret is, how she can have so much zest for life, to which Toyo says, "Listen man, it's not all sunshine and roses for me either. All I do is work and eat. The most I can do is try to have a little pride in my work." She shows Watanabe one of the toys she makes at the factory. She says that making these toys, it's like she's making friends with all the babies in Japan. Toyo suggests that Watanabe try making something, and a moment later, he has an epiphany. He knows just what to do. Filled with renewed purpose, Watanabe hurries down the stairs, as behind and overhead, all the young women in the restaurant appear and, like a choir of angels, sing him happy birthday. Suddenly, the film takes a brief detour into a sort of magical realism, until almost immediately it's revealed that the singing isn't for Watanabe after all, but for the young woman who's arrived just out of frame to join her friends. The reason why this moment is so crazy to me is how it pulls together so many different tonal and thematic elements into a single dramatic overture. I think it makes a good starting point for talking about the film as a whole, for trying to unravel what makes Ikiru so enduring almost 75 years later. For starters, in both the happy birthday scene and throughout the film in general, there's a recurring generational divide. Ikiru examines life and death by contrasting the young and the old, those with their entire lives ahead of them and those with one foot in the grave. More than generational, the divide is compounded by a national and cultural divide specific to the post-war Japan. There's a reason why these young women are all singing in English. After World War II, the Allied occupation of Japan resulted in a country that was rapidly Americanized, that underwent a sudden influx of American music, American fashion, and American systems of government, something which the younger generation seemed to have an easier time acclimating to. This national generational divide is something that recurs throughout Japanese post-war cinema, in the films of Yasujiro Ozu, in some of Kurosawa's other films like Drunken Angel and I Live in Fear. It's a divide which crops up repeatedly in Ikiru, not just in the happy birthday scene, but in the way Watanabe's daughter-in-law laments the draftiness of Japanese houses, in the way Watanabe flounders through a gauntlet of tawdry late-night jazz clubs, and in the way Toyo seems to stand out at the public affairs office, what with women in the workforce being a relatively new post-war idea. In a lot of these post-war Japanese films, the younger, more Americanized generation is often depicted as being more frivolous, more selfish. In Ikiru, Watanabe's son and daughter-in-law seem more concerned with the man's retirement fund than they do his well-being. When eventually Watanabe does try to tell his son about his illness, he's interrupted and accused of impropriety with Toyo. Meanwhile, the Japanese nightlife is anonymizing and indifferent. Meanwhile, the public affairs office is a maddening web of bureaucratic excess. That's one of the other main through lines of the film, is bureaucracy. In Ikiru, bureaucracy is sort of the modern face of alienation, a Kafkaesque web of middle management, ostensibly working toward the same goal, but all out to pass the buck on to somebody else. In the end, Watanabe's redemption, his finding some sort of meaning in life only comes about by cutting through the bureaucratic morass. He gets the park built not because of, but in spite of the bureaucratic process. At the end of the film, Watanabe's co-workers can hardly believe it. How can anyone have accomplished anything when bureaucracy all but prevents it? They try to piece together Watanabe's last few months on Earth by the same bureaucratic process. One guy tells one anecdote, another guy tells another, and to a point they succeed. Even so, there's still the notion that all any one of them had to do was go up to Watanabe and say, "Hey man, how you doing? You doing alright?" None of this is to say that Watanabe never had a hand in his own alienation. The film is as much about personal regret as it is anything else, and Watanabe is as much the author of this sort of culture of indifference as is his family, his co-workers, or the strangers in the jazz club. Watanabe is meek, he's cowardly. In flashbacks, we see those moments where he's failed his son. We see his single-minded devotion to his work. That's one of those things that makes Ikiru such a rich and complex film, is how pointedly it connects the individual with the cultural, the material with the spiritual, and how the redemption of the one turns out to be indivisible from the redemption of the other. The fact that Watanabe's final act on Earth is to build a playground in place of a cesspit speaks to not just the redemption of an individual, but the restoration of a country, the bridging of generations. Watanabe is able to recapture his youth, to find some meaning in life, not in frivolous pleasure-seeking, but by helping others, in rediscovering what it means to be a public servant. The cultural particularities of a post-war Japan serve to tap into a more universal existential truth, that life is brief, and that all of us, in one way or another, will have to face death alone. Maybe the only person in the film who actually knows what Watanabe is going through is the Yakuza boss towards the end of the film, whose own sallow complexion suggests he doesn't have long to live himself. The last thing I want to say is just how good Takashi Shimura is. None of it works without this guy. You know, I don't speak much Japanese, so I imagine there's a lot of subtleties in the dialogue or in the inflection that gets lost in translation. But even so, there's something in Shimura's performance, in his hunched posture and his thousand-yard stare, in the way he barely speaks above a whisper. It's a performance that transcends language. This is a guy who 2 years later would play a completely different character in Seven Samurai. Upright, forceful, commanding. I started off talking about the happy birthday scene, but of course the really defining moments of the film are first in the jazz club, where Watanabe first sings the gondola song and brings the entire club to a standstill, and then later near the end, where he sings it again in the park on his last snow-covered night on Earth. The tears in Watanabe's eyes, the pain in his voice. If you don't get choked up right along with him, then you're sick. There's something wrong with you. I could stumble through talking about themes and subtext and etc., yada yada, for who knows how long, but then none of that matters if there's not that raw nerve at the center. None of it works without Takashi Shimura. None of it works without the tears in his eyes or the waver in his voice. In conclusion, Ikiru is a really good movie. Okay, let me know what you think. Subscribe. I write books. If you like books, I'll put the link for those down below. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.